Brian treated us all to lunch, 15 shillings a head, then gave us his present. He announced that we couldn't possibly live in my bedsit, and that he had a flat he seldom used, which we could live in for as long as we needed it. John looked at him in amazement, and I was so excited by his kindness that I threw my arms around him. Never keen on public displays of emotion, even at weddings, he was embarrassed but pleased to have made us so happy. Neither of us had known that he owned a flat. Brian told us he used it from time to time to entertain clients, and we didn't question it. In fact, we later realized it was his bolt hole. He still lived at home with his parents and needed somewhere to escape to, away from prying eyes, where he could take partners or just enjoy a little privacy. It was typical of his sensitivity and generosity to give it up for us. That afternoon we moved into the flat in Faulkner Street. Brian helped me collect my things from the bedsit, and John fetched what he needed from Mimi's. This was something John's parents most definitely hadn't had, a little place in which to start married life together. We had a lovely ground floor flat, tastefully decorated and furnished, with a bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, sitting room, and even a little walled garden. Over the next few weeks, John was preoccupied with the group, fulfilling engagements and preparing for their first recording. When John was at home, we enjoyed playing husband and wife. He was loving toward me all through my pregnancy, bringing me flowers or little bits and pieces for our home. Once he came in from a gig and said, "Close your eyes, Mrs. Lennon. I've got a surprise for you." He insisted I feel the gift he'd brought home before I opened my eyes. It was an ancient coffee table, but he behaved as though he'd just got it from Harrods. "Isn't it fantastic, Cyn, our first coffee table? Look, it's handmade, battered copper, only a £5." Despite my misgivings about it, I couldn't help but be swept along by his enthusiasm. Not long after we married, I met Ringo. He joined the group 5 days before our wedding, and a few days afterward he came round to see John. Although I'd seen him play many times with Rory Storm's group, we'd never spoken. Unfortunately, we got off on the wrong foot. I invited him to stay for supper and served up curry. I didn't know that after a lot of childhood illness he couldn't eat spicy food. He refused it and was very offhand, virtually ignoring me as he chatted to John. I was miffed, unable to work out what I'd done wrong. Later I decided he probably thought I was stuck up. It was the old over-the-water thing again. He came from one of the roughest parts of Liverpool and thought I was a snob from the posh side. Perhaps I made him nervous. Ringo and I were wary of each other for some time, but gradually we became good friends, and I discovered that he was one of the most kind-hearted, easygoing and good-natured men alive. Even before I came to like him, I knew he was right for the group. At 22, he was 3 months older than John, and he fitted in with the other boys as though they'd all been together forever. They shared the same quick-witted, irreverent sense of humour. He could give back as good as he got from them, and they loved that. A couple of weeks after our wedding, Brian and the boys had gone to London to sign a 5-year recording deal with Parlophone. A week later they recorded their first single, Love Me Do. John and Paul had written it, and I was surprised they'd chosen it because I didn't think it was one of their best. I found it a bit monotonous. But John said that was the one George Martin wanted. He liked John's harmonica playing on it. John told me they'd done so many takes of Love Me Do that he never wanted to hear it again. They'd had to play it about 20 times, and the same with the record's B-side, P.S. I Love You. Worst of all, halfway through, George Martin had decided he didn't want Ringo and had brought in a session drummer. The boys were upset and Ringo was devastated, but none of them dared say anything. George had already overstepped the mark when George Martin told them, "Let me know if there's anything you don't like," and George quipped, "Well, for a start, I don't like your tie." That remark, so typical of the boys' humour, had been immortalised since. But at the time they were afraid they'd gone too far, that they'd better shut up and get on with the record. It was released in early October, and to Ringo's relief, they used the version in which he was playing the drums, although the other drummer played on the B-side. By this time, the Beatles, though still unknown elsewhere, had a huge and possessive local following. Girls queued outside the cavern for hours to see them. Sometimes in the middle of the night, the boys drove past and saw girls waiting for the next day's lunchtime session so that they could get places right at the front. Just before the boys came on, they would take turns to nip into the loo and tart themselves up so that they looked their best for the Beatles. Ringo's new girlfriend, Maureen Cox, had already discovered that some fans hated any girl who got involved with the Beatles. Maureen had been a fan herself, though never an avid one. She was a trainee hairdresser who went to the cavern with her friends whenever the Beatles were playing. She'd kissed Paul for a dare, but really fancied Ringo, and was thrilled when he asked her to dance a couple of weeks later. When Ringo started dating Maureen, she had to pretend she wasn't seeing him. One night she was waiting for him in the car outside a gig when a girl came up, put her hand through the window, and scratched her face. She managed to lock the doors and wind up the window before the girl could do anything worse, but it shook her. With incidents like this on the increase, John didn't want me to put myself at risk, and I agreed with him, but it meant I saw less of him. Around this time I persuaded John that we should go to see Mimi. He had been so hurt by her reaction to our marriage that he hadn't spoken to her since. Though I wasn't fond of Mimi, I knew she was important to John, and I hated the idea of any lasting rift. John had lost too many people already. It took a lot of cajoling, but eventually he agreed. When we got to Mimi's, she welcomed us with open arms. I realized she must have missed John, and too stubborn to approach him, was glad of an opportunity to put things right. Over a meal we caught up on all the news. While she wouldn't admit to being impressed by the boys' record deal, Mimi conceded that they had done all right. It was high praise. To our surprise, she offered us the ground floor of the house and said she would move upstairs. It was kind of her, and we couldn't really refuse. I'd been afraid and lonely in Brian's flat, and the Beatles were about to go back to Hamburg, so John and I were in for another long separation. At least with Mimi around, there would be someone to call on in an emergency. We packed our belongings, thanked Brian for the use of his flat, and headed back to Alton. Soon afterward, the boys flew to Hamburg to fulfill a contract they'd agreed to months earlier. Before they left, we heard that Love Me Do had reached number 27 in the charts, and Brian announced that he'd got them a tour in February, supporting Helen Shapiro, a 16-year-old girl whose powerful voice and hits like Walking Back to Happiness had made her a big star. Love Me Do crept up to number 17. I was hearing it often on the radio, which was wildly exciting. While John was in Germany, it was impossible to stay out of Mimi's way. Without her nephew there, she treated me like the hired help. She was frequently grumpy and never asked how I was feeling. I often felt that she had no real interest in me, other than as a means to keep John close to her. It was so rare for her to be cheerful that I actually noted it in my diary when she was. One entry read, "Mimi in a good mood. Change." On top of this, when John phoned me once a week, all he could afford, as international calls were expensive, Mimi always leapt to the phone before I could get there. She would chat to him for the next 10 minutes, giggling girlishly, and only called me to the phone when John's money was about to run out. Often we had barely time for more than a quick hello. John sent me enough to pay Mimi's rent and to buy what I needed, and I was grateful that I didn't have to worry about money. Since my dreams of being an art teacher had collapsed, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was glad to put off any decision until after the baby was born. John came home briefly in late November, but had to head off to London almost immediately to record the group's second single. George Martin had a song lined up for them, which he thought would be perfect. It was called How Do You Do It, and he was sure it would be a hit, but the boys didn't like it and balked at recording it. He told them to come up with something better, so they suggested their own song, Please Please Me. Reluctantly, George Martin agreed. How Do You Do It went to Jerry and the Pacemakers and became a huge hit for them. John and Paul always wanted to do their own songs, though, not someone else's, and they wanted it enough to stand up to the great George Martin, of whom they were in awe. When he agreed to Please Please Me, they were delighted, but nervous too. God, I hope it works, John said, when he told me about it. We look like idiots if it doesn't. Soon after they'd finished the recording, they returned to Hamburg for their 5th and final trip, and stayed there through December.